Okay, may I have your attention, ladies and gentlemen? It's just a few people moving between rooms. Very interesting work from Brian Shaw, and we look forward to seeing ongoing results as we go through. Maybe we'll get you back to speak to us again. Second speaker struck me in my job as a GMIT lecturer. I attend many seminars, presentations, CPD events, etc. during the year. For the past year, one of the worst I attended and also one of the very best I attended had the building regulations in common. So you'd be very pleased to know that the very best one was presented by Eamonn Smyth, who's our next speaker. So Eamonn is advisor to the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government in the area of building regulations, building standards and control. He's worked extensively over the years in the development of the technical guidance documents that we all use and development of standards for both radon remediation and inspection protocol for legacy septic tank issues following the intervention by the European Court of Justice. Eamonn is a Galway man, St Jarlath's, and then on to NUIG, where he graduated as a civil engineer, and he'll update us today on recent and near future changes to the building regulations.
Back for some reason. Okay. Good afternoon. I think we are just about afternoon. As you said, my name is Eamonn Smyth. I'm a civil engineer, work with building standards. I suppose, first of all, this morning thing was interesting insofar as and disappointing at the same time in that the ACOM says that the quality is third on the list and cost is the first. And we've been working very hard to kind of get quality up there, so it's a bit disappointing. I saw on the other side, the construction industry were in favour of BCAR, which is actually good considering the hammering we got on it. Today, I put up what next, because most people go, what next are they going to come up with for the building standards? And I'm going to do a very quick run through of what we're at and where we're going. Any of you that have heard me speak before know I can do an hour on any one of the building regulations, so to try and cover four different sections of it is going to be a pretty rapid overview. So let's go. Building Control Act is where the power comes from. That gives the Minister the power to do the building control regulations and the building regulations. Building control regulations, as I said, you're all sick to death of them. They're BCAR, lodgement of plans, design certifiers and whatever. That's all in place. It's been in place since 2014 and it is having an effect, absolutely. People are now looking, whereas before they signed certs, now they're statutory certs, they're actually liable, and they're now being very cautious about what they sign. Behind that, what's happening, we have the BCMS system, the Building Control Management System. And at the front end of that, we're now in the process that we're talking about innovative technology and whatever. We're working to be able to put both fire safety certs and DAC applications online in that system. Behind the system, we're introducing a risk analysis. So when you fill out the form and you say you're a multi-story building or you're a timber frame multi-story building or something else like that, it flags it up as a higher risk than other buildings, and then the inspections by the Building Control Authority will be done on a risk basis. That's where we're going with that. The building control officers themselves will actually have handheld app systems where they can download any of the forms you've actually put in. That you put online when you were putting it in for validation. At your commencement notice stage, it will also have be able to do all of the plans and all of that. Oh, I must have been clicking on things. Right. On the other side, we have the building regulations. That's really what I'm talking about today. One of the points I would make is that, you know, achieving all on the right-hand side under the building control gets you no place. The whole purpose of them on the right-hand side is so that the building regulations are complied with, to make a building safe for people in and about buildings. That's the aim, if you like. That's the mission of the building regulations, is to make for the health and safety of people in and about buildings. That's what they're there for. There are controls in place so that we might achieve that. There was a delegation over from Norway recently, And when I asked them, do they have a robust system like that? No, they don't. Do they have a problem with compliance? No, they don't. When they introduce a regulation, the builders and the designers and everything take it all on board. We haven't achieved that yet. Okay, so if you haven't been in the game since the downturn, you'll see that we've done a hell of a lot of work, good or bad. You can decide on that yourselves. But basically, that's where we've gone with all of those. Where we are, I don't know whether I can point with this thing. Yes. Poor old Part C is back there. We're trying to do it. I started it back in 2014 and got sidetracked into Fire and Part L, mainly Fire, and so we're still trying to work on Part C. But from that point of view, we are starting work under the pyrite report and indeed the blocks report. It's recommended that Part C comes out. You know, Part C SR21 for a hardcore was revised because of the issue that we had with pyrite. I keep pressing that by mistake. So what I'm going to talk about today actually is B and L. They're the ones that are on the cards that are being done substantially. And as I say, Part C, we have initiated some work on it. We're looking at maps, wind maps, wind-driven rain, spell maps, highest and lowest temperatures for affecting on steel and stuff like that. The other bit that Part C is becoming a very serious document because we're looking at renders as well, monocouche renders, single coat renders, external insulation. The whole ball game has changed. If you think about it, you go back, you look at the document right now, all you have is a mention of cavity walls. But now we have single leaf systems with external insulation. My SCAI colleague there mentioned it. They're doing it in a retrofit. They're also doing it in new. But you have to have a situation where is it robust enough for the Donegal coast when the winds are lashing in off the sea? This is where we're developing the wind maps and whether they're appropriate or not in certain areas, whether certain types of construction. Other side of that, rain screen. You saw the issue in Grenfell. The rain screen went up like a candle. That's another issue. From the Part C point of view, we're looking at it. From the Part B point of view, we're looking at it. Okay, so Part B. What? Oops. This is like a gun. So basically, Part B started in 2012. We went out for what we call a pre-revision consultation. We got 44 submissions, actually over 1,000 comments. We also set up a working group of stakeholders to actually review the comments and come up. What did they come up with? They came up with the idea of having 2 volumes. One for dwelling houses, that made it more simple to understand how you complied and how you got safety in dwelling houses. It's interesting to know the statistics show that 80% of the fatalities in fires are actually in dwelling houses. We're inclined to think of multi-story buildings, we're trying to think of apartment blocks. No, 80% happen in actually dwelling houses. So the document Dwelling Houses, Volume 2 we now call it, is specific for dwelling houses, and then the other one we're going to have buildings other than dwelling houses. The dwelling houses document came out and is applicable, was published in 2017, and that is actually applicable from the 1st of July 2017. This is the legislation. What did we do? Well, we changed just a tiny bit up there, and I'll explain that in a second. Normally when we do a regulation, we basically take out the previous legislation and drop in the new one in the second schedule of the building regulations 1997. We didn't do that this time because we wanted the legislation to stay in place for buildings other than dwelling houses. So we dropped in B6 to B11 in it. We already had B1 to B5 if you've ever looked at Part B of the building regulations. So now we have B6 to B11 dealing specifically with dwelling houses. It's as far as the existing legislation stays, and it allowed an early transition. People came out to me, what about a transition period? You don't need one. We didn't want one because we're not changing anything substantially in the house. We're changing alarms, we're changing escape routes, but we're not actually changing anything that would affect your planning permission or that would have made a change. So there you have. What did we change in the legislation? Now this is the legislation, not the TGD, remember. Always there is a difference. So what we did is we put in a means of warning. Before this it was just escape. We put in means of warning and escape in case of fire, and a dwelling house shall be so designed and constructed that there are appropriate provisions. I put in that specifically. I wanted that put in because there was an argument, or at least I saw a legal argument there, that you could say, well, I've provided an adequate escape route. You had the lads sitting and still sitting on the stairs there. We don't design for that, lads. You're actually that's supposed to be a clear way so that in the event of fire, everyone legs it out there and they're not tripping over ye and your bags on the floor. And that's the actual point. So by putting in that stairs, you could say, well, I've provided the escape route. Now we wanted, and there was an extrapolation that was within the TGD, but it wasn't in legislation. It's now in legislation. You must have an escape. The other thing is dwelling house. That was just a new definition. Dwelling house is a dwelling that is not a flat. That's because dwelling and flat are already defined in legislation. TGD, as I said, comes in the 1st of July. All dwelling houses started after that date must comply with the regulations. There's no planning exemption. I had questions. What about if I've started? If you've started the dwelling, then the building regulations that existed before the 1st of July applies. If you start after the dwelling after the 1st of July, then it's after. Does that mean you could have different requirements on the same estate? Absolutely. You could have one side of the estate running with alarms just in the living room, kitchen, and in the actual corridors, and in the rest of the house you also had to have them in the bedrooms. Because remember, under a High Court decision in 2003, the building regulations applies to when the work started. Okay? Did I jump one there? Okay. So, what are the changes itself in the TGD rather than in the legislation? And remember, the TGD are prima facie compliance that you've complied with the legislation. But the legislation is what you technically have to comply with, and legally what you have to comply with. What we've done, the biggest change probably that we've made, is that we've made a new purpose group 1D, which is community dwelling houses. We were asked to do this by the HSE and by some of the charitable organisations, because under the strategy for decongregation of institutional buildings to communities, they were moving people out into community dwellings, style dwellings, but at the same time they were obliged then to actually meet the requirement of Purpose Group 2A, which was seen as a bit excessive and was costing a fortune to actually do. What we've designed here is that you can actually move them out into what's known as a community dwelling, as long as you meet certain criteria. And in that instance, we've then reduced the standard. But there are assumptions in that. So we have a higher level than a dwelling, but lower than a Purpose Group 2A. But it only applies in certain circumstances, only 3 stories, only 8 bedrooms. But they don't attract a fire safety cert or a disabled access cert. There was a calculation done. If you take an existing house to change it to the community dwelling standard, it will cost about 40,000. To change it into a Purpose Group 2A, it will cost 140,000. And so my own personal view is that if for charitable organisations, or indeed any organisation that's building them, the HSE, if you're building it new, I go for a Purpose Group 2A so that you can accommodate all categories of people with disabilities. I would go for, if you're converting one, I would go for a community dwelling and limit the uses of it. So there's your community dwelling house. That's what you're defining it as. What have we done? As I said, 3 stories, 30-minute fire resistance to all. Doesn't matter about the height. So in the normal house, if you're full half-hour fire resistance only occurs in 3 stories. It's nominal half hour before that, it's full in a story. In these houses, it doesn't matter if it's a bungalow. We still want a full protected corridor so that you can have time to escape because of the disabilities that you may have. We're hopping all over the place. Also, it's an LD1 system. LD1 Fire Detection and Alarm System to IS 3218. And it also has a control switch which tells you where you can silence all the rest, and it tells you where the actual fire will be. And obviously we have alarms in all the bedrooms and the other attic spaces. That's what an LD1 system gives you. Okay. We introduced, through the fire services, we wrote a fire safety and community dwelling houses, a colleague and myself, for these. This not just goes through the fabric elements which are in the TGD, but also the management element and the assessments that's required. And that applies obviously then not just to new build, which building regulations would apply to, but it also applies to houses that are now being used as community dwelling houses. Okay, so that's an important document. You can download it from there as well. Okay, back to the main changes to the TGD. Main changes: fire detection alarm system, the LD2 system. I call it the PADI LD2 system. I'm not particularly happy with it, because if any of you that are across the border, you'll understand that an LD2 system in the UK is different now to an LD2 system in Ireland. And I'm not particularly happy with that. It would have been nicer if they put it as an advanced LD2 system. Our LD2 system requires you not only to have it in all the areas we previously had, this thing is wild, but also to, or me, it's one of the two of us. But it not only it requires you that, but it also requires you to have it in all the bedrooms, as well as all the other areas, the risk areas. That's our LD2 system. As I say, you need to be careful. You have contractors that come across from the border working in the south, and they say, oh, you have to do it to an LD2 system, and they do it to the UK LD2 system, which is non-compliant. In that sense, I don't like it. Also, new extensions. If you're doing a new extension, you put in an alarm system. But there's also a scenario where you may have to put it in the existing house. Normally, the building regulations do not require, except for change of use, the building regulations do not require you to do works in an existing building unless you're doing a material alteration, and then it's only to the works that you are doing. In this scenario, if you're caught, and I'll show it to you for a second, here. So, you put on an extension at the back, if I get this pointer right, and you have an enclosed garden out the back, which would happen a lot in cities where you have the garage was developed beside it and you have no way out on the side, and then you're surrounded on both sides and at the back with another housing estate. And so what happens there is you have an enclosed garden. If you don't have this distance, in other words, if you don't have a safe place, Martin talked about going to point F, I think, outside for fire early on for safety. That's the spot. And if you can't have that, then you must alarm the actual building itself, so that if you're sitting out here having a drinks in the evening and the child sets the place on fire inside, then you'll know at least that the place is on fire and get out. Okay, that's another change that's happened. Other change. In the current 2006 document, we say when you're replacing windows, it is recommended. We've changed that now for dwellings. If you're doing a dwelling, if you're putting new windows in a dwelling, you should meet, as far as is practical. We've put that in because we're not asking you to break bigger holes in the wall than exist, but you should try to meet the actual escape. So in a normal house, in anything that's built in the last 50 years, you will be able to meet the fire requirements, and you should meet the fire requirements for an alternative means of escape in it. And in the case of all other rooms, you shouldn't make it any worse. That's always a rule, by the way. That's always a rule in the building regulations. It says you can do no new or greater conflict to the building regulations. So if you have a building that doesn't comply, you can't make it worse. If it does comply, you can't then create a non-compliance by works you do. That's there in the Primary Act. You can't do that. Okay. Oh, there we go. Yes. Readily openable. I had a question here. I had a question actually in from some building control during the week, yesterday actually. And anyway, the readily openable applies to the primary route. The primary route, it's like here. The primary route for escape is up there and out there. In a house, it's along the corridor. If you're in a bungalow, it's along the corridor and out the front door. If you're in a 2-story or 3-story, it's down the stairs and out the front door. So that door must be readily openable now. It used to always apply in a 3-story building anyway because you had a protected corridor. It wasn't much sense to have a protected corridor and you're getting down to the bottom and discovering that the keys are in where the fire are. You must have a readily openable. Now it's applying to all dwellings. Readily openable primary. You don't have to have it on the patio door or on the back door. That was the question I was asked. No, it doesn't apply to them, except if you had a patio door that was acting as an escape route for an inner room scenario, or in a 2-story house where the patio was out onto your balcony where you were looking over the River Corrib, for example, and that was acting as your alternative means of escape, then you'd actually have to have that readily openable as well. But otherwise, no. The other thing is we require a PV provisions on isolation of the PV. That's the PV arrays. That's the big in thing at the moment for renewables is PV. That's fine. But in the event of fire, you have to have a situation that it isolates the actual DC side. So imagine you have a fire, fireman goes in. Their automatic thing is they pull the main fuse on the outside, the AC side, and that kills everything inside, so he's feeling very safe, except that your inverter here is down in the utility, and it's got a 20-foot line above in the attic that's all still live from your PV above on the roof, and when he pulls at the ceiling to try and pull the fire, he connects that and gives himself a very, shall we say, put some sparkle in his eyes, to say the least. You know, you're talking about maybe 800 volts that you'll actually get off that, you know. So it is smarting a lad up, to say the least, you know. So there are other ways of complying with this, by the way. There are other ways of complying with this, and we've come up with what one might call a more practical. So there's a fire safety switch that you can use, that when he pulls the fuse outside, it automatically, it is a 15-second delay, but it automatically then kills it as it comes in. So you'll be bringing your PV array line, your DC line, in through the fireman switch and then down to your inverter. The other option is put the inverter up where it should be and leave less than a meter from there in. That's a picture there. We had some consultation with some consultants, and they made up a mock-up out in the house that I went out to in Dublin, and you can do it that way, so that when you bring the PV array into the building, you shorten the length of what is going to be DC live, and so when you pull the fuse outside, it kills it as far as the inverter there, and therefore you only have a very short piece of wire, so it doesn't present the risk that it should. So you've eliminated the risk. Other thing that we have is galleries. A gallery is another story, just to be clear. A gallery is another story in which you must comply with the requirements of 132, 133, or 134. So that's 1 story, or 2 story, 3 story, or whatever. Except where? This is the exception, but it's the exception as long as you meet these requirements. Oops, there we go. As long as we meet these requirements, so that it's not greater than 50% of the room, 3 meters from the stairs out to the door, 7.5 meters across there, and it can't be a sleeping area. So you can sit up there and have your drinks and tut at the world, or you can look over the lovely vista across the River Corrib there, or whatever, but you can't be sleeping up there. Be comatose after a few drinks. You can't be doing that, because then you won't know to get out, and you'll have the fire underneath, and we'll have another fatality. Okay. This is a big change, guys. This is a big change. We used to have diagram 17, and every builder in the country said, oh, I'm complying with diagram 17, so I don't need a cavity barrier. We've taken that diagram away because diagram 17 was never complied with in the first place, and because it was you could comply with it, have all your ropes sealed, and then your man comes in for the dryer and drills a hole through and puts a nice little old plastic bitting of a pipe in, and the minute you have a fire, it goes shooting straight into your cavity, and not only do you burn your own house down, but you burn the neighbours down as well. So in this case, you must have, we are now requiring, and you saw it in the external insulation as well, that's also a requirement of the external insulation. There, you must have a cavity barrier that comes from that's your party wall. You come across, it must extend out to the inner face of the outer leaf, whatever that outer leaf is made of. And you'll see where it breaks, so that's non-combustible or limited combustibility. So that could be any insulation, expanded polystyrene, cabin enhanced expanded polystyrene, polyisocyanurate, or PIR as it's known, but then you must break it there. Come back. So it must break it there in order to make sure that. You also need cavity barriers, of course, now at the top of the walls. Historically, you always did, by the way. But we got it there because everybody put a block on the top. Now we've taken away the block because of the psi value that it creates at the interface between the ceiling and the wall, and you get cold bridging at that point, so we've taken it away. But you need a cavity barrier. Otherwise, anything gets in the cavity goes shooting straight up and the roof's on fire. And you're sitting down inside having a cup of tea and the roof's on fire. That happened actually in a Swords case. It was a timber frame where a guy went torching. He was doing a torch, fixing a minor leak on a flat roof section on a timber frame building, and he caught the insulation inside, or not he caught the actual felt inside. It shot through the cavity and up, bypassed all the cavity barriers in this. It was an 11 house block. and straight up. So inside in the house you didn't know anything was happening at all, but the whole roof was on fire, and all the cavity and the structure that was actually supporting the roof was also on fire from the inside, from inside in the cavity. These are the cavity barriers. That applies now to all houses, to all dwelling houses. Okay. Last one on Part B, and the only reason I put this in is Eurocodes and the fire parts of the Eurocodes. The Eurocodes came in 2010. They were mandated in the Technical Guidance Document A in 2012. And the Eurocodes assume a fire protection of the structures. And when it assumes that fire protection, the performance is based on the European test method, not BS 476. It's EN 1365, 1364, and 1366. These are the Eurocode methods, and you'll notice that the thickness of slabs will have increased in a lot of cases. I've been having great fun burning stuff over in England, but it was legal. It was in Warrington in the test lab, and we've discovered, quite shockingly, that a lot of the stuff isn't making the requirements. So I issued guidance, by the way, 3-4 weeks ago on timber frame walls and separating party walls. And by the end of this month or beginning of April, I intend to issue another guidance on web joists. Web joists have become very common as a use, because you can get your heat recovery ventilation system in through them because of the weaving of the actual metal web. But they don't have the same thing as a solid joist. So I'll be issuing guidance on both the fire resistance underneath and also any penetrations in them. Same thing with regard to trusses. Trusses where you need a fire resistance, for example, in a 3-story building or in a 2-story with an attic converted. That has to be a full half-hour fire resistance. We were testing over in England 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, a truss in the proper manner. We're not very happy with some of the testing that has gone on. We've developed, you need to be very, very careful. But I hope to issue further guidance on that in the next 3 to 4 weeks. But that's why I mentioned that. Any of the tests you're talking about, it should be to the European test method. Okay, where are we? That's volume 2, as we call it, dwelling houses. We're at this stage now with Technical Guidance Document 2006. We're going on with the revision of that for buildings other than dwelling houses. And what's happening there is we're hoping to get it out to public consultation by the end of this year, some stage late in the year. It always goes for 3 months public consultation because that's a standstill period in Europe anyway. We must inform Europe every time we bring in a building regulation. And then we'll finalise it next year. And there will be potentially a longer transitional period for that, because imagine that you've developed, or you have a Terminal 3 in Dublin Airport ready to go, and then we bring in something. So there will be a transitional period on that. But obviously, it's also that document is, to be honest with you, I'm not very happy with where we were with it, and so we're probably changing a substantial amount of it right this minute. And of course, then it's also influenced by the Grenfell disaster. Just we're looking at that and looking at what the reports say on that as well. So that's where we are with Technical Guidance Document B. Right. The other one that I've been asked to talk about is, near zero energy buildings. So this is where we're talking about. This is what everything's driven by the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. Just about everything energy. Colleague in SEAI, whose name I can't remember, and apologies for that. I never can remember anyone's names. But that's what's been driven. That's what's driving more or less everything we've done in the last few years with regard to energy. So it says basically, member states should ensure that all new buildings are nearly zero energy buildings by 31st December 2020. And that's a strange one, because the way they actually say it is that they should buildings on completion. Now, we always say buildings starting from a date. That's not the way Europe did. They said being occupied by 2020, which kind of leaves a kind of a strange one. And I know that my colleague Sean Armstrong made the point at Europe, said, well, we have a fair few buildings started back in a while back that isn't going to meet that one. Member states near this area 31st for public buildings, and then major renovations to be cost optimal. And actually, AECOM that we're talking here this morning, they did the cost optimal analysis for us under contract. So that's it, very low. So basically, and again, back to the colleague in SAI, exactly that. We've always said, first you reduce your energy requirement, and then you get the best, most efficient way of providing the bit of energy that you do need. And they're saying, and some of that has to be from renewables, preferably on-site or near-site. There's the RTE, RTE PV array there. So, for major renovations, 25% of the surface of the building envelope undergoes renovation. Just to be clear, when you talk about that, that's the thermal envelope. So that's not just the walls, it's also the ceiling and the floor. It's 25%, not just the walls. So if you're doing windows alone, that's not going to make up your 25% and it doesn't kick you into something else. But we're looking at that when at the moment. The other thing is, a minimum energy performance is technically, functionally and economically feasible. If there was ever an out, that's it, but we have to work out what that exactly means as well. And we are under an infringement from Europe. They don't seem to like us in Europe. They seem to love to fire an infringement against us any time if we don't move fast enough. And Martin mentioned I was involved in the infringement and the court case on wastewater treatments. With the wastewater one back in the day, and they fined us 2.7 million and 12,000 a day for every day that we weren't in compliance. And they have the potential to do the same. They can do that when they take an infringement against us. So we have to act fairly promptly when we do get an infringement against us. So, okay, so what's happening in dwellings? Well, you all know this already. Come back. Right, they're definitely a dangerous thing here. Back in 2005, it was about a C1, 160 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. We took that as the baseline in 2005. We took that as the baseline, and then in 2007 we want a 40% improvement. So we got an EPC of 0.6. In 2011 we said we're 60% improvement. So we got an EPC of 0.4 and a CPC of 0.45. And it looks like where we're going now is 70% improvement on the base house in 2018. It'll be equate to a BER 42 of an A2, nearly zero indoors. So that's where we're going at 10%. That's not too bad actually, because we're nearly there already in the 60%. It won't mean as much as we'll say if we weren't there already to a certain degree. So that's what we have. I remember Part L now that's what we require. That's what we require, an EPC of 0.4, right, and a CPC of 0.45. Current regs, that still stays. What are we doing? So, again, Europe, they didn't like the fact that we hadn't told people, so we had to do an emergency amendment, SI4 amendment to the technical guidance document, just to tell you where you were going. So, back in 2017, we put in that that near zero in Ireland will mean an EPC of 0.3 and a CPC of 0.35. We said that back in 2017 to tell you where we're going, but it doesn't apply yet. We just had to tell you where you're going so that if you're designers out there building houses designing for 2020 or whatever, that you'll know what you should be designing to. So that's where it is. A full review of the dwellings, that's actually ongoing. Public consultation, we're going by, my colleague Sean is working feverishly in conjunction with actually colleagues in SEAI. In fact, I was supposed to be at a meeting this morning on it to develop the document Part L. It'll be 2018 or 2019, it'll be 2018. But so it's going to public consultation by the end of this month. We'll hope to have it finalised in potentially September. It depends on the comments and, of course, on the Minister. So the Minister has the final say in most of these. But again, as we are under infringement, we will be pushing to get this out. Where is it gone again? Then it'll apply in early 2019, maybe either applicable from either April or June or something like that in 2019. So that's where we're going with dwellings, but we already know where we're going. So in real terms, we know that this, and we know this. It's a question of how do we achieve it? How do we achieve it? That's actually where it's going. So it'll be advanced fabric performance, improved air tightness, calculating the thermobridgings, renewables, and review of ventilation provisions. So we're probably going, the fabric, as stated in Annex E of Technical Guidance Document L right now, probably won't change much. The default, the backstop values as they're known, will probably come down from 0.21 to 0.18 for a wall, and probably for the glazing from 1.6 to probably 1.4 and stuff like that. But they're the default. In real terms, to make the EPC and the CPC, you're always going down lower than that anyway. Those backstop values are to prevent you from saying, you know, I won't put any insulation in the house at all. I'll put a rake of PV out in the garden and on the chicken shed and every other place, and I'll still make an EPC, which technically you could do. But that means then you're not actually, in the first instance, reducing your energy demand. And that's the first criteria: reduce your energy demand, then provide the energy that you do need in the best and most efficient way possible. So that's where we're probably going. Air tightness will probably be coming down from 7 cubic meters per hour per square meter to about 5 cubic meters per hour per square meter at 50 pascals. Renewables potentially, I don't know whether I have a slide in here, no. Renewables will most likely be changing from 10 kilowatt hours per square meter, which is what we have now, to a percentage. That's what's happened in TGDL non-domestic, and that's most likely where we're going to be going with that. It'll be going to a percentage of the energy required for the dwelling once you've brought it down to a level, rather than a dead 10 kilowatt hours per square meter. Okay, so major renovations. This is one that we're still teasing out. What it says is, again, 25% of the surface of the building envelope. If you do that, then you end up having to do other ones to a cost optimal. And as I said, AECOM did some calculations on cost optimal, and they're coming up for various different houses, cost optimal in the order of a B3. So we're not clear where that brings us, where if you take the G houses that you're talking about and you're doing some work, it will trigger you into doing something else. That looks like what it's going to happen. What that actually means, we're teasing out. That will come out in the public consultation later on this month and in the final document later on this year. But that could be potentially onerous, you know. It's not clear, but you know, it could be potentially onerous where you intended doing works, you know, because it may force you into. In a lot of cases, it may only force you into doing a new boiler and stuff like that. We don't fully know. Right. Part L, other than dwelling houses, this is out. So we had extensive consultation on the stakeholders. We gave hints at what NZEB would be for public buildings back in 2017. We had to do that. Then TGDL buildings other than dwellings, that's already published, downloadable from our website, and it comes into force next January. No choice. Comes into force next January, right? What does it mean? Where are we gone? Yes. But once it didn't jump on for me. So we've done this slightly different. So whereas before we based it on for dwellings, we based it on the 2005 house, and we said, now you're reducing it. In the Part L, we didn't get to actually renew to do it, so we've jumped in. So what's in Part L is in fact your compliant near zero building for non-dwellings. And what you will end up with doing is having an EPC of 1. In other words, you equal what's in the document. And it equates to a 60% improvement on the 2008 document, improved fabric specification, advanced services, renewables. There'll be a requirement for renewables, again, of 20% of the energy required. But if you go below the parameters as specified in the appendix, it's Appendix C, then you can potentially reduce your renewables to 10%. Okay, so there's, hold on now, so there's a comparison. There's a comparison of just for a very quick. So right now on the 2008, the current one, your walls are, you must have your walls at not a U value of not higher than 0.27. That's going to be changing to 0.18 to make it. Now that's not the backstop. The backstop will be 0.21, but to actually be able to make the EPC of 1, it'll be 0.18 or better. Roofs down to 0.15 and floors 1.5. These are also air tightness. It's 10 at the moment in a building other than dwelling houses. That'll go to 5 where the area is less than 200. That's gone to 5 where it's less than 250 square meters, and down to 3 where it's greater than 250 square meters. Window U value, window U value 2.2. It goes, it's going to 1.4. That's no big deal. It's only that might give you a problem though where you have big windows or stuff like that. Solar energy transmittance of 0.4. There's your, basically most of it, 75 litres and 1.8 watts per litre second. So, and variable speed fans, you'll need variable speed fans rather than what you have now. You could have just a one speed one. So so the controls have tightened up. There's a requirement for renewables now. So there's all of that, and so that's where we're at with buildings other than dwellings near zero. That's in, by the way, lads. That's in. That will apply from the 1st of January next year. The transitional arrangements, I'll be probably heading out the door now with planning permissions just to try and get them in, but basically the way the transitional arrangements on this one works is that all works, basically the building regulation, it comes in the 1st of January, but if you have the work started, by the 31st of December, then obviously it's the existing building regulations. That's the way all building regulations apply, by the way. If you have the work started before the regulation comes in, then it's the works that apply at the time. I give this example that, for example, the houses that were started in 2006, it's the building regulations that applied in 2006 that apply to those now, even though you're finishing them today. It's not the building regulations of today that apply. It's the building regulations that apply when you started the work. However, if you didn't start the work, but you have planning permission in place, well then, before the 31st of December, then you can work to the old regs, but you must have it substantially complete by the 1st of January 2020, which only gives you a year. Right? So if you haven't started the work by the end of this year, but you have planning permission in place, for example, then you can go ahead with under the old regime, but you must have it substantially complete. And substantially complete, as defined by the High Court again back in 2003, was at wall plate level. Okay, that's some of the ones in the projects going on: OPW building in Leeson Street, ESB headquarters, and the forensic labs. Major renovations, again, we're back to this. Now, in these ones, it potentially means it's easier. 25% of the surface, if you're doing more than that, then you may end up having to upgrade inefficient heating systems. But that's if they're 15 years old and they only have a certain performance. There's 2 criteria involved there. The same way, upgrade inefficient cooling systems. Again, if they're 15 years old or they have there's certain criteria within the TGDL, I haven't put it in here, of the efficiency. And then upgrade inefficient lighting systems. So that's where that is. You can go onto the website, Building Standards, click on that. You can find world of stuff in there, okay? Thank you very much. Sit up there.